At some point, whites became the unprotected class in America. We're allowed to talk about that, but how long is it going to last? Jeremy Carl's here. I'm James Poulos. Welcome to Zero Hour. Jeremy Carl is in the chair. He's been studying cultural issues in America for over a decade, even serving as a policy advisor to national political figures during his time at Stanford University as a research fellow. He is here today to bless us with his extensive knowledge. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks so much, James. It's a pleasure to sit down and talk with you.
You got the red tie. The orange man is coming back.
Yep.
And white Americans are part of a big tent now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually the fascinating thing, right, about this election. And in many ways, this is a best case scenario, and that, somehow like all the minorities voted for the Nazi and they just, forgot to realize it, I guess. Right. And so I do think that this gives the possibility of kind of folding an anti-white discrimination agenda into like an actual thing that is not just about white people, but about a kind of multi-ethnic group of people who don't want to discriminate on the basis of race, who just want America to be great, right? And I think it's really exciting to see that a lot of these folks on the left who claim to speak for the agendas of various groups kind of got exposed.
Well, it is exciting. We got your book right back there on the shelf, The Unprotected Class. It is not yet obsolete. So just like lay it out. So what's the thesis of the book? I know it was, some people wanted to grab it with radioactive tongs a couple weeks ago, but now we're allowed to talk about all this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I mean, I was obviously very nervous when I wrote the book originally. Not very nervous because I'd sort of decided that I'm going to write it no matter what.
Moderately,
but I was moderately nervous about how it would be received, and what I saw is from guys like Tucker and Donald Trump Jr., but folks who were obviously very movement people embraced it. But it was embraced by a lot of people who were not even particularly political, not even particularly conservative, who just said, hey, this is a conversation that we need to have. And I really tried to have it in the book in a responsible way. I mean, again, it's not a work of racial identitarianism. It's certainly not a work of white supremacy. It's a work of saying, hey, right now we've got a lot of anti-white discrimination throughout our society, and we should be talking about it. And we should fix that because we want to get back to, even though it's slightly cliched, but we want to try to embrace a country where we're focusing on the content of our character and not the color of our skin. And we can't do that when we're kind of telling one group to get to the back of the line and they're not even allowed to complain about it.
Yeah. So a whole basket of issues here. A large part of the problem, as I know you agree, is we somehow wound it up with this like sort of priestly caste of spiritual overlords kind of telling us who counted as white as a matter of this newfangled religion that they were slapping together. But there is sort of I think a lot of Americans, especially today, are sort of like, what is whiteness anyway? Like, what does it mean to be white in America in 2024?
Yeah, well, and there is what you're seeing, I think, again, as people try on the left to comprehend what happened with Trump. You're going to hear a lot more about multiracial whiteness and everything else. And what that basically just means functionally is people who are not white who want to be part of the American project and be perceived as normatively American, which is, of course, a wonderful thing and we should encourage. But this, of course, drives the left to rage like almost nothing else. And so you have that going on. At the same time, sort of what counts as white, this is actually less of a moving target than people think. Again, you can read a lot of these leftist scholars who get very cute talking about how the Irish became white or how the Jews became white. And there's a whole literature around this. And at some level, this is true. And I do talk about this in my book, that obviously, even within the white community historically, there's always been a so-called caste system. I mean, if you were sort of British descent of a certain class, at the beginning, or you were kind of a WASP, you were sort of at the top. And if your name was maybe suspiciously Greek, maybe you weren't as high. If your name was Jewish, you weren't as high. But at the same time, even back in 1790, when we had a naturalization act that was limited to white people at the time in 1790, nobody was unclear on who that is. And it would have included a bunch of people who, would not be seen as maybe culturally at the top of the status pecking order. But at the same time, like, people could get a little too cute with this question and be like, oh, well, these groups became white. No, they were always kind of considered white. The way I talk about it in the book is really kind of using that legal definition. I don't kind of get into these abstract whiteness studies questions. I just say somebody who's treated white legally by the regime, they are the white people I'm talking about. And if somebody is a Hispanic, but they look, whiter than me, but they're not treated as a white person by the regime in terms of how it passes out certain favors, then they're not in that category.
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely become capricious, and it really is like a vast invitation to like me search,
right,
and anecdata,
right,
and master's theses and even probably PhD dissertations at this point. I mean, my dad growing up in Detroit, Michigan in the 1950s, there were signs at the public pools. It's just invidious discrimination against those swarthy Mediterranean Greeks.
Yeah.
So fast forward to the 90s, and the one of the big trendy academic books at the time was Black Athena, and it was all about how, like, actually no, the Greeks were, well, maybe they weren't really African, but they were kind of more African than they were white. I've been slowly morphing into just full dad joke mode and just like humor, entertaining myself with these jokes and never letting them die. But for me, my working definition of whiteness has always sort of been, well, it was kind of like what you got when all of the different Europeans just kind of intermarried.
Correct.
And in that sense, like, whiteness is kind of the beacon of inner ethnic harmony.
Yeah.
Certainly relative to Europe, and we got a little bit of that white ethnic disharmony in Detroit and Chicago. It's all in Chicago. You just street, running battles in the streets, and the Poles came to America and were reviled for being, sort of all these anti-Polish stereotypes. So it's like, our collective memory in this area has really been like very short, and it's been sad, I guess, to watch so many younger Americans really with no recollection of even what their parents or grandparents went through in terms of sort of ethnic animosity.
Yeah.
Just spending, 2 to 4 years in a crappy college and coming out thinking that, all of America needs to be put to the torch because racism.
No, absolutely. And I actually talk a little bit about kind of, again, I don't get into the construction of whiteness so much less kind of like trying to have some Nazi adjacent racial mysticism category of what whiteness is. But I think you're correct to observe that it really starts, frankly, after the Immigration Act of 1924, which is the strictest immigration law ever passed in the United States. So you have that, and basically immigration slows down dramatically. You've had this big influx of white ethnics from various parts of the world at that time, the so-called off-whites, as some people would call them. And you have the stopping of immigration plus World War II, and it acts as sort of a cultural mixer. And so the point you get to like 1950s, this has been going on for a long time, and all of the Greeks and the Italians and whatever else are going through this process of Americanization. And by the way, I think the relevance of this, and it's one of the recommendations in my book, is I think that if we stopped having kind of racial categorizations for which we were awarding or penalizing people, I think that could happen to a lot of other groups where we could kind of build a new American majority that's going to include all sorts of multi-ethnic people, a lot of Hispanics who are, of course, predominantly of European descent. And it's not that, of course, if you're not in that group, that your rights are somewhat less. Not at all. I mean, everybody needs to have equal rights. But in terms of a cultural majority, we could begin building that kind of new American identity right now if we stopped trying to push people apart, which is essentially what we're doing.
If you're like me, you grew up on beef jerky. It was a must-have for a road trip. But have you read the ingredients they're putting in jerky? Maltodextrin, MSG, synthetic nitrates, artificial flavors, tons of sugar, and allergens like ultra-processed soy and gluten. Ugh. Not to mention most jerky companies use the lowest quality of imported beef. There's the dilemma. You need protein on the go, but beef jerky is laced with lab chemicals from the globalist laboratories. Enter Farmer Bill. Farmer Bill's Provisions is a rancher-owned meat snacks company in South Dakota that offers pasture-raised meat snacks. He makes biltong. It's like beef jerky, but without all the bad stuff. Just beef, apple cider vinegar, sea salt, coriander, clove, white and black pepper. That's it. No sugar, no soy, no nitrates. You can try the 4-pack sampler of their pre-sliced biltong, but I would recommend going for their best-seller bundle, which includes the 4-pack, a half-pound slab, and 2 of their grass-fed tallow balms that will nourish that dry, wintry skin. The pre-sliced biltong is perfect for protein on the go, and the slab is great for snacking at the house or hosting a party. It's like a huge dry-aged ribeye that you can slice off little steak strips for snacking. Grab Farmer Bill's bestseller bundle with free shipping and an extra 15% off with 0 hour. Use the code 0 hour, one word. Go to www.farmerbillsprovisions.com or click the link in the show notes. The owner of Farmer Bills is a listener of the show, so let's support those who support the show. Use code 0 hour today.
You mentioned these sort of like bizarre and recondite, like racialist memes and kind of that corner of the internet. I think sometimes it can be hard for people who aren't as like online as we are to understand like how to just a set, like, so wait, they're these guys and they actually say that they're real Nazis, but then they're just like, all they're doing is telling jokes, but then some of them are like not funny. So just like help people understand like what is going on in that corner of things. Yeah. How much do you think it's like a real problem, and how much do you think it's ultimately just kind of like a laugh?
I think I wouldn't be so dismissive as to say it's just a laugh, but I also think it's much more politically marginal. Like a guy like Richard Spencer, who's kind of one of the biggest guys to come out of that world, kind of claimed
famed CNN analyst Richard Spencer.
Yeah, I mean, I think he gets his most publicity when he got it from the left.
Yeah,
and that he's out there endorsing Kamala and whatever else. Mm-hmm. I think that these guys can be very loud on Twitter, but their political profile in terms of the right is much more marginal. It's just not where the overwhelming majority of conservatives are. They don't want to engage in that sort of stuff. And I mean, I think that there are people, and I think, the only worry would be that if we don't stop the kind of anti-white discrimination and racism going on in our official institutions, you do push a lot of angry young white men in that direction, because they say, well, the system doesn't have anything going on for me. So, these guys are kind of offering this vision of greatness, right? And that's kind of what they do. But I think at the end of the day, these are pretty marginal people for the most part. And some of them have gone after me. I mean, because, I'm not a purist enough, and I'm very much, this is a civic nationalist book and not an ethnic nationalist book.
What is it, like the A10 blue eyes?
Right, right. Yeah. And the whatever the hair thing, is also, I can't remember what you call it, but it's also insufficient. But yeah, it's, I think the number of people who really are deeply engaged in this, who are not online, is small. And you can also tell, by the way, because for all of the freaking out, the amount of like white directed racial violence from white people that's going on toward minorities in this country is like trivial. I mean, it's, the Juicy Smollett,
notwithstanding,
right? It's just, it is truly, I mean, but it's like a man bites dog sort of story when it really does happen. And I'm not saying it never happens, right? But so I think that these guys are mostly much more bark than bite.
You opened with the joke of this broad-based multi-ethnic coalition of Trump voters not realizing that they were voting for the fascist or whatever.
Right.
But, by the same token, a lot of these guys online who, not fascist, but reactionary, just sort of openly like, no, like this project has failed. We must return.
Right.
Let's go. Most of those guys, from what I can tell, and this is, now becoming a running joke on the internet, is most of those guys are themselves Latinos.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, there's definitely, and maybe I should say, I'm almost hesitant to say the word Nick Fuentes, because I feel like somebody will like come out and attack me, but
you're summoning.
Yes, I'm summoning the demon, but yeah, I mean, right. Like, it's sort of funny that the kind of most notorious of these so-called white supremacists today is this guy who is at least partially of Latino descent. I've not put his whole family tree to some sort of examination, but yeah, you have some of this overcompensation going on, right? And it's sort of, I wouldn't call it so harmless as to be a joke, but it's a reaction and frustration to the straitjacket that they're being put in. And this is, kind of what I talk about in the book, is the elements of that straitjacket. And I'm really hopeful that with Trump, and I'd be delighted to be a part of this in some way if I can, but that the administration comes in, and I think there's definitely the mindset and the knowledge that we didn't have in 2016 to really take a sledgehammer to a lot of this stuff, at least as far as the government goes, and to return us to a greater degree of freedom of association, and just, as not to be trite, but as Justice Roberts said, the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And so I'm not under any illusion that we're going to be able to fix that in 4 years, but I do think that in some ways the particularly multi-ethnic element of this coalition that Trump has put together gives him a unique kind of platform to do that, because it's really hard to say, well, this is just like the desperate last gasp of white people against the tides of minorities who want to crush them, when in fact, this is a very multi-ethnic coalition that's saying, no, we're just not going to, treat other Americans this way. And so I do think that is a unique and not entirely unexpected opportunity, because you saw some of these trends even in 2020. But I think even for somebody like me who was very bullish on Trump's chances, the degree of shift, particularly among minority voters, was quite something to watch.
Yeah, well, I mean, for professional or semi-pro ideological trend watchers like you and I, God help us. Some of these trends have been visible for quite some time, and when you're talking about the politics of that sledgehammer, just like breaking up these really ossified legal structures. I think a lot of people, outside of that fish tank, shocked. What are all these Jewish guys doing? Sort of wanting, why aren't they sort of playing the victim card or Michelings? Right. So a lot of those guys are right at the front. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And again, you look at in Florida and Texas, I think Trump took strong majorities of not just Hispanics, and these are not small groups, right? This is not sampling error, right? When you have like 26% or whatever, 35%,
Miami,
you can figure it out. Asian Americans, he also won a majority in those areas, and then even huge numbers of young black men as compared to previous times. So there really are opportunities, and it is much better. I kind of talk about it at the beginning of the book that this can't just be a project of white people like whining about how they're oppressed and trying to play a victim class and seeing if they can get something against other people, that it has to be ultimately a consensus reality that people of a wide variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds agree that we've got this problem and are trying to address it. And at some level, well, there's a million things going on that it's from a political science perspective, overdetermined Trump's victory. This is one of the things that I see in it. And again, I think that's really exciting.
I want to talk a little bit more about free association, but first, just, you look at the way that Trump has won in those categories. Yeah. And he did win women outright, I think. Nevertheless,
married women.
Yeah. Nevertheless, looking at that gender gap, which is real, and then looking at, where did this politics of racial and ethnic grievance come from, and how was it reified into these institutions and laws? Yeah. How much of that is really more about gender than it is about race? How much of that apparatus, that superstructure, is really ultimately the creation of a certain kind of woman and a certain kind of white woman?
Yeah, well, there is the HRification of our culture, and in fact, Richard Hanania, who's kind of written on somewhat similar subjects, has talked about, I think I quote this in the book, in 1950, 27% of corporations had HR departments, right? And now it's like 99%.
Now it's 110%.
Right. Yes. And so these sorts of things, yes, it is. There's two things going on. In fact, my next book is going to be all about how horrible liberal white people are and how they're destroying everything. So it's not that I'm letting liberal white people, and particularly liberal white women, off the hook. At the same time, I want to be a little bit careful in that sometimes when people say that, they kind of use it because they want to avoid any sort of uncomfortable racial confrontation. And I have enough respect for the political agency of every community in this country, ethnic and otherwise, to say, hey, you know what, there's been a lot of bad actors in the African American, the Asian American, and Hispanic communities who have a lot of power and who have misused that to kind of foist various anti-white things on society, and they need to be responsible for that. So that large disclaimer being made, I do think that the white woman HR lady, who's often very left-wing, is definitely been a huge part of this problem, especially in the socially elite way. And in many ways, you could actually trace the origins of this, as I'll do in my book, back to the 19th century and some of the social amelioration and improvement that went on among a certain class of kind of what we would now call, though it was not recognized at the time, progressive white women.
Well, I can tell that the book has been a success because here you are talking about your next book. So congratulations. That's how you know it's real.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Okay, so freedom of association. One of the things that evidently we are now allowed to talk about with the free speech that was constitutionally guaranteed to us is just bringing back into question, the whole kind of civil rights superstructure of laws and regulations. Until very recently, this was sort of like, you'd get the zap if you talked about it. There are obvious reasons for that. But I think at the same time, especially coming out of COVID when sort of nobody had civil rights for a minute there, like, whoa, what's going on? The vibe shifted, and there are now questions being openly asked about whether we need to fundamentally reform or even throw out some of these civil rights laws. How do you unpack that, and how do you sort of distinguish between what we should keep and what we should dump?
Yeah, and I talk about this a lot in the book, but the origins of the civil rights laws and essentially what I think we should keep and what we should dump, although I don't get too granular on that because I think that ultimately has to be part, again, of a political process that's going to involve consensus. If one group just tries to...
Some of this goes into federalism.
Right. If one group just tries to impose that vision on other groups, that's not going to work well. And in fact, it's sort of interesting because this book, while it's pretty radical in a lot of ways, although I think it's helped change the conversation in the few months it's been out already, that it's maybe a little less radical than when I wrote it. But I'm actually a lot more understanding of the civil rights movement than some of the critics, and that I don't in any way pretend that like pre-1964 we were in some racial nirvana in America where everything was perfect until these like horrible people came along pushing civil rights. No, I mean, there were real problems that we had in America that were serious and that needed to be addressed. And I think what happened is we took this instrument that was civil rights law, Civil Rights Act of 64, but it was a very blunt instrument and it did the job that we needed it to do at a basic level. But then it kind of is such a blunt instrument that there was a bunch of things down the line that it began to cause a lot of problems. And then I think it's also important to do, if you kind of look through the debates around the original Civil Rights Act and then a lot of the things that followed on from it, that there were a lot of things that it was really clear both from the text of the act and the debates around it where everybody was like, well, it won't do this, it won't have quotas. Of course, you wouldn't have anything that became like disparate impact doctrine or any of these sorts of things. And then a few years later, the administrative state and the courts get it, and that's exactly what we're doing. And then we get follow-on Civil Rights Act and a bunch of things that the people who, with very good intentions, put in the original Civil Rights Act never would have contemplated have come to pass. So that's where we are. Again, I try to be understanding of the history that we have. But at the same time, I think that particularly in the private sector, that's where we need to really focus on restoring freedom of association. There needs to be a presumption that people are allowed to discriminate, and I mean that in the most neutral sense, meaning they make a choice about
this and not that.
Right, this and that, not that, and that as long as the government is not doing that, that should be a permissible thing. And to the extent that we've lost that, it sort of becomes, I mean, it sounds like, oh, well, who would want to discriminate? Well, I would hope nobody would want to discriminate just on the basis of somebody's skin color. But what it functionally becomes is not that actually somebody's saying, no Hispanic people are allowed there. It's ends up in the real world, it's somebody suing because there's only 3% of Hispanics in this group, but the reference population is 20%, so there's discrimination clearly going on here. And what I want to do is just eliminate all that type of thinking and allow people in their private lives, in their private businesses, whatever else, to associate with whom they want to associate with and not have the federal government kind of dictating that to them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've lived through this. There was once a time when the respectable boomer who was sort of running the show in America had this kind of bipolar vision of freedom where it was freedom of speech, sacred, sacrosanct, burn the flag, Nazis marching down the main street. Yeah. That's all great. But freedom of association, bad, racist, KKK. And it was this, you couldn't really reconcile these two components.
Right.
And sure enough, you fast forward to the 2010s, and lo and behold, it's freedom of association bad, KKK, racism, drinking fountains, free speech also bad.
Yeah.
Talking about the KKK, saying racist things, saying mean stuff that because of what race you are, that turns into mean racist stuff. And that distinction collapsed.
Right.
Well, meanwhile, the reality of the situation is freedom of speech is great. Freedom of speech is constitutionally protected. But if you don't have freedom of association at all, then your free speech is basically toothless.
No, that's correct. It's the similar way that people sometimes talk about the Second Amendment being the right that vindicates all of our other rights. I think, again, freedom of association is just it's such a fundamental thing. And my colleague at Claremont, Christopher Caldwell, who wrote a very good book on this, sort of talks about there kind of being two different constitutions almost, and that the new civil rights constitution in many ways replaced, in this sort of awkward way that nobody really acknowledged at the time, the original constitution. And again, I try to be historically understanding of how we got there, but I think we just need to peel that back. While at the same time, I mean, I want to be clear, like at a governmental level, we absolutely can't, I mean, we can't have freedom of association in that way.
Right.
Like, we're not going to have the government saying, well, this race gets to do something, or I get to like only associate as a government with, black people or whatever it is, right? It's just like, you can't have that. So there has to be a stricter standard for things that are purely governmental in terms of nobody putting a thumb on the scale, but also people's private lives need to be returned to that.
Caldwell's book, Age of Entitlement.
Yeah.
Great book. I think it's a great companion with Helen Andrews' book on the boomers.
Yes.
Because just so much of what's tied up in all this sort of racial politics really has to do, I think, a lot with that kind of social psychology of the boomers as a generation, that psychodrama that they went through with civil rights and with Vietnam and with kind of like the beginning of this cultural tug of war within really Protestant Christianity over what is this denomination? What does this mean? Where do we stand politically?
Right.
What about our retention rates? Does this all need to just become sort of literally like multiracial kumbaya?
Yeah.
These things all played out, and many boomers, this is kind of like their final act as eminence grise, political authority in America.
Yeah.
And there's still so much tied up in this idea of like, gosh darn it, what do we have to, which of these levers do we have to flip in order for us to be this kind of happily united, multiracial, multi-ethnic society where you're colorblind but not too colorblind, and you're sensitive but not too sensitive, and you're judging people by the content of their character, but you're also not, saying things that sort of make them feel weird. And I just, I understand having spent most of my life growing up in boomer society. I understand kind of where this is coming from, and I don't want to be dismissive of that experience because it was really in so many ways like nothing else that Americans had been through. But at the same time, it's like, maybe it's not going to be any of these switches, and maybe it's not going to be any combination of these switches, and maybe you're striving for some kind of like cathartic spiritual experience that just can't be found in political or social life, and is ultimately something religious. And if you want that experience, like, the church is right there, folks. Like, there it is. You can all go in there, but the boomers have by and large, been fairly resistant to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's a ton in that comment that I want to unpack. I mean, first, I think Helen Andrews' book on the boomers is great, and I'm glad you mentioned it because there were certain themes. She actually gave a very kind review of my own book, and I think she didn't mention her own in that context, but I think she probably,
as one does,
she probably saw some of those same context that I was talking about. And I, of course, absolutely agree with you as a fellow Christian about the church, right? That as people have left the church, that kind of search for the transcendent within the secular turns out to be very ugly, as it almost invariably does. And whenever we try to immanentize the eschaton, it always turns out very badly, which means
and very disappointing. This melancholy that sort of haunts the so much idealism and and look what happened. The black family was destroyed, and now there's crime and just spirals and spirals.
Yeah. Well, and people have. I mean, you mentioned the black family being destroyed. This is again one of the things I talk about in the book because it's so absurd. Some of the things that I talk about, they'll look at illegitimacy rates within the black community and they'll say legacy of slavery and racism. And if you go back to 1940, of course, the illegitimacy rates of the black family were not just way lower than they are now, they're way lower than white illegitimacy rates are now.
Especially in certain parts of the country.
Right. So it's like something happened to the broader culture that was not about race relations that sort of poisoned this. But I think the final thing that you mentioned in your comment that I really want to pick up on is, of course, Trump himself is a boomer. And he is a boomer par excellence.
Extraordinaire.
In so many ways. Yes. I mean, right? And it's interesting to watch him interact with JD Vance, who, clearly he really likes. And I think JD really likes him. But JD, who's kind of an older millennial. And, I think in many ways, Trump kind of has this boomer view of all these things deep down, underneath it all. Whereas JD has grown up a little more online and everything else. And sometimes you're like, whoa, don't show your power level quite that much, JD.
Right.
But he just, I think he has a little bit more of that astringent experience, for lack of a better term, that's been applied to him. And I think for that reason, maybe he sees some of these issues in a little bit more of a clear-eyed way. And frankly, when we finally really get going on him, it's probably going to be people who have kind of gone through that ringer, like Vice President-elect Vance, who will be kind of leading that charge. But in the meantime, I think Trump sort of instinctually kind of understands where we need to go on a lot of these issues and is trying to unite people around a kind of an American nationalist pride and identity. And I think that's great,
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. Both with regard to Trump and JD, but I'll go one step further. And for those of us who have Zoomers in their lives, it's Zoomer guys on the internet who spend probably way too much time on the internet, quote unquote, who have become so familiar with Black culture, and so comfortable sort of speaking the language, exchanging the memes, like really admiringly in some respects, and also like not admiringly in others, and seeing those kind of what to a boomer or even like an Xer would seem like pretty distinct moral categories. Like, no, you are literally like making fun of these Black people because of the way they look or whatever, versus like, and yet you're also like borrowing all of their slang and laughing at their jokes and listening to their music. Those things have really started to just mush together in the experience of the Zoomers, and it's been fascinating to see.
Yeah. Well, and my older two boys are kind of core Zoomers, and they're sort of have had their, I don't want to say political awakening because they're not radicalized or anything, but they get a lot of their political experience. Whatever they don't get at the dinner table, they're getting it on the internet in this meme culture and this meme worlds. And so, yes, I think all those sorts of things come into play, and they're going to navigate this space in a way that they will look back and say, oh, you Gen Xers, you just don't get it. Now, I'm proud that the Gen X, by the way, did show that we were the greatest generation, the real greatest generation in by far being the most Trump supportive
outright majority
generation.
The only one, right?
But yeah, no, we were the people who grew up during the Reagan era, at least for some of the older ones of us. I think that probably plays into it. But yes, there's sort of complicated racial identification and all sorts of things going on online. And again, I think the important thing is if we don't stop some of the institutionalized discrimination, that can go in a very bad direction with people because they're seeing, I mean, my older boys just see it. And it's not just them, by the way, it's all sorts of unrelated young men of that generation come up to me and they're like, as a white guy, I'm just shut out of all of these institutional things. And in many ways, they're going out and starting their own things, which is what discriminated against groups have done from time immemorial. But on the other hand, so I mean, at one level, that's giving them a certain extra degree of drive, but it's not healthy for society. What we want to do for society is welcome in everybody equally and not make me feel like, as is functionally almost the case if I want to go to an Ivy League school and I am a white guy without connections, it's pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
And that is functionally, unfortunately, the system we're in today.
Yeah, they're aware of it. And, if you're like a teenage guy and you're looking at the college situation, you're thinking like, well, I'll take my chances on a startup or something.
Yeah. No, my oldest is not going to go straight to college because he's looking at the system and he's just like, it's a scam.
Yeah.
Not even necessarily per se, because I think he would certainly acknowledge some of the things that I'm talking about here, but that's just one of a million different ways in which he sees that like the system is not going to be friendly to him or people who have his background. And so he's just like, well, I'm going to navigate, I'm going to do a startup or whatever, ends up doing. Right. But it's going to kind of work around that system. But that's a huge waste of human capital when we don't kind of offer tracks for everybody. So
no, it's really not good for America for higher education to be totally discredited and be this sort of zombie thing living off of these huge endowments. Young guys, of course, overwhelmingly for Trump. I think as a cohort, they made the largest sort of rightward move of the demographics, and not a surprise considering how black coded Trump has become. I mean, the memes have just been out of control, and it has been funny, and he's leaned into it, and it worked.
He has no, and he again, and he is interesting in that he did that. And I think this is a lesson for white people in talking about race in general. He was just himself. Yeah. He just in the same way that when he goes to McDonald's, he's still wearing the suit, right?
Yep.
It's just he didn't try to like put on the work overalls and say, whatever. He didn't try to like wear gold chains and say like I'm, a rapper just like you. He embraced them in all of his white boomerness. And he didn't apologize for being a white boomer, but he's like, hey, I love America. You love America. We can both kind of do our thing here, and that's great. And people just there was a certain swag and energy that he just had that I think was again something that transcended race. But I think one of the most important things, he never apologized for who he was. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a goal that I have for all white people, is to not kind of apologize for who they are. And that's really a lot of what I wrote the book about.
All right, so let's come down to the ground level of just nuts and bolts policies here.
Yeah.
We have a moment. We got 4 years to play with.
Yeah.
Maybe more, depending on how high JD's power level truly rises. What can actually be done, do you think, in this landscape, and where are going to be the main obstacles?
Yeah. I think the main obstacles for certain things will be 60 votes in the Senate. Yeah. Now, I think we can one of the things I would like to see us just do in general in policy more is do what the left is functionally done, which is like create facts on the ground. So just say, you know what, our legal opinion is that we actually can do it this way, and we're going to do it this way, and we're running the government, so we're going to do it. And, what are you going to really do about it? I'm not suggesting that we just do that in a way that discards the constitutional structure. I'm suggesting that we copy what the left has done and be very aggressive about interpreting a constitutional and legal structure in ways that advance our own agenda and not apologize for doing that. So I think 60 votes in the Senate will be a problem for some things, but I think getting rid of DEI throughout the government and kind of just that well has already gotten poisoned to a degree, but just making it a completely poisonous well, I think we can do a lot with that. I think we can expand tremendously on this new Supreme Court affirmative action ruling. It's not totally clear. Does that apply to employers right now? Is it just college admissions? Again, I think we can create realities on the ground. I think even if you create legal ambiguity around some of these things, or a sense that there's going to be a back and forth on them, what you're going to find is, the truly devoted woke corporations are still not going to go with you unless they're sued. And folks like America First Legal are kind of doing that. But if you just give the space open, then the companies that aren't really woke, they just want to run their businesses, they will say, great, I'm not going to be woke because I don't have to be anymore. So I think you can get a lot by doing that. I think we can continue to push cases to the Supreme Court that just simply make it clear that we're not going to have legalized discrimination of any type in America, period. I think one of the best things we could do is get the court to declare disparate impact legislation, which is, this complicated the history of it, but it started out as a Supreme Court case, and then it got written into the Civil Rights Act of 1991. But just to declare it unconstitutional, disparate impact. Again, I talk about it in the book.
Now it becomes a magic wand. It's whatever you want it to be.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But just for the viewers here who may not be familiar with kind of the history, disparate impact is a doctrine that basically, and I'm oversimplifying, so lawyers, please don't yell at me. But if you've got like a 20% reference population that belong to a certain group, whatever it is, say Asian Americans, and you have some sort of an employment hiring process, and you come out of that hiring process and it's only 3% Asian Americans, it could be said to have a disparate impact on that group, and you are potentially legally liable for discrimination lawsuits unless you can jump through all these hoops and show that you had business necessity.
It's shading into a presumption of guilt.
Right, really here's the key. I mean, this is the real key from the original Griggs versus Duke Power case. Duke Power, which is the 1971 case, is sued, and they say, well, but we didn't mean to discriminate. You can't show any intention that we had
no mens rea
to discrimination. And they didn't, that's like, we don't care.
Yeah.
It just doesn't matter. Right. And so that's really where the Rubicon was crossed. Mm-hmm. And so I think just getting back to a point where we say, this is just not the business of the government to be picking and choosing and racial bean counting in that way. I think that will help a lot. I think using state power to enforce better teaching in our schools. And maybe some of that is just really opening up school choice much more dramatically, because the way that these schools are able to be such hotbeds of leftist idiocy is because they have no competition. And if the money follows the student, all of a sudden there's more opportunity. And it's funny because school choice is kind of historically this slightly boomer libertarian thing, but I think we can actually do quite really dramatic cultural improvement by really opening that up. And it'll provide more opportunities to African American and Hispanic students in the inner cities, and that's great. I mean, I'm all happy for that, but it'll actually just do really good things for everybody. So I think there's opportunities to do things there, and we need to get more comfortable with actually using state power, and that is something that the right in America has historically been uncomfortable in doing, and we need to get rid of that type of thinking in general. I mean, not that of course we should be aware of potential for abuses, but if one group is always using power and then the other group when they get into power is like, well, we don't believe in using power at all.
That's guaranteed abuse.
Yeah, right. So it's just there needs to be a certain balance of terror, to use the Cold War term, that needs to be achieved between the right and the left, where we kind of decide that actually, we kind of get to a point where we have developed enough of a credible deterrent against the left that they're like, hey, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't just go be at each other's throats all the time. Let's just find a way to work together. And then I will welcome that, right? Like my vision of America does not involve that we must crush every single person who ever had a leftist idea and eliminate them. It's that, it's get off of my lawn, right? Like that's where my problem is.
Well, and a lot of these guys on the left now are really licking their wounds, and it's always mortifying when you get slapped around so bad. And they're not going to go off into the corner and commit seppuku. Like they're going to be around, and there's still like many millions of these people. And a lot of them want a way out. Like the wokeness did not eat the entire Democratic Party apparatus. There's still a lot of people in there who are sort of trying to at least pump the brakes, and they need an out. And if we don't help give them an out, then it's that's not going to help anyone.
No, that's right. You've got to have a combination of carrots and sticks. And again, I talk about this in my recommendations in the book, right? So you've got to have a thing where you realize that 48% of Americans who voted for Harris, they're not absolutely crazy, right? Like their leaders, I would argue, are crazy and probably need to be crushed. But a lot of them are they're either just have a different way of looking at things, or they're getting really bad information from the regime media or whatever have you.
And many genuinely just thought that Trump was unlike any person who's ever existed and had to be treated like his own category one.
So, you need to reach out for those people who are looking for a way out. And that's, again, why I talk about the importance of having a societal consensus that can't just be something where white people are complaining and imposing whatever they think on everybody else. And at the same time, you've got to, metaphorically speaking, just metaphorically, put some heads on pikes.
Always metaphor.
You've got to really show that some of the worst actors who have enabled some of the worst stuff, that they are that their careers are destroyed, that they are no longer able to participate in as political leaders. And when you kind of have that credible deterrent for really, really bad actors on the other side, then you can begin to work with moderates.
Yeah. So just to cross the T on the legal stuff, I know that some of it can be a little bit in the weeds, but it's important. There's a lot at stake, and people should be aware of kind of what the lay of the land is. You mentioned American First Legal. There's this whole kind of conservative legal apparatus that grew up beginning in the 80s, Federalist Society, others. A huge amount of hopium pumped into that side of things over the course, especially of the Obama years, where it was like, well, we may be sort of, kicking ourselves in the nuts a little bit, and no Gadsden flags on the convention floor, we're super good. But at least we have, at least we're churning out these rock-ribbed conservative legal guys, and we're going to take the Supreme Court and the appellate and all that stuff. And, expectations were very high. It's hard to meet expectations that high. But there was a pipeline, and it kind of filled up the space with some decent guys. Over time, some of them developed a reputation of being maybe too squishy to be of much use, and maybe a net negative in some respects. Kind of a risk that you run with any kind of establishment building enterprise. Do you think that whole sort of movement conservative legal apparatus, as it stands right now, is ready, willing, and able to hit the ground and do the work of changing those facts on the ground that you mentioned earlier?
I mean, you've asked the $64,000 question, and when people have asked me, like, what do I care most about in terms of personnel in the Trump White House? It's not anything that I might do in the administration. I mean, I'm sure I could do useful things if they want to have me back at some point, but it is OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, and the White House Counsel's Office. We have to control those with really hardcore people who just don't give a damn, and that, like, what the left is going to say about them, and are willing to be very aggressive with good legal opinions, not like shoddy stuff, but like stuff that could really stand up to serious scrutiny to say, look, this is why we're not letting you get away with this kind of nonsense anymore. And they're willing to put a risk out. And by the way, so much of what the left strategy has been in going after our attorneys, in going after my Claremont colleague John Eastman, in going after my friend Jeff Clark, and putting all these Trump attorneys in jail, or disbarring them, or doing what they did to Giuliani, is to kind of try to send a message that we're going to destroy you if you kind of try to make those legal arguments. Well, now we're going to control the government, so we have these guys on the back foot. We've got to turn the tables and have that. We do have, I think, enough good conservative lawyers to do that, but whether we can get all those guys in the pipeline and have them be the ones who are selected, that remains to be seen. Now, I think
you're talking about two, small offices, relatively speaking, that probably most Americans have never heard of. You feeling bullish about those?
Cautiously. I mean, I'm not close enough right now. I mean, I'm going to be going to D.C. in a week, and I'm going to spend some time with folks, and maybe
I'll ask you after that.
I'll have a little better sense of how to answer that question, because obviously these things, we have the transition planning in process, and I know some folks there, as I assume you do as well. But I'm cautiously optimistic because I think Trump understands what was done to him, and he understands the need to be aggressive. And he's never been shy in his personal and business life about deploying aggressive attorneys on his behalf. So he understands that world. And I think now he understands he needs to be just as aggressive in terms of the sorts of attorneys he's going to put in the White House counsel's office or what have you. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but we'll have to see. And then maybe, hopefully, some of these more establishment guys who are very pedigreed, we can bring them along, because people can change, or even people could be transactionally useful and just realize, hey, if I want this fancy job, this is what I'm signing up for. Right. And that's great. We got to work. That's politics.
So the case of John Eastman.
Yeah.
One memo. He just really persecuted out of all conceivable proportion.
Sure.
Made an example of.
Yeah.
And just the damage that kind of punitive behavior does to the broader right wing is hard to measure, because what happens is, you have institutions that need to stay mission oriented in order to defend themselves, but still pursue their objectives when they're out of power, which is where a lot of those conservative institutions found themselves in the dark days of the post January 6th world. And when suddenly, as an institution, you now have to choose between spending your precious, earned media or your little PR campaign, or what have you done this week? To use Elon Musk's phrase, what have you done this month? You might find yourself in a position where you have to choose between pursuing your mission and going to bat for someone like John Eastman, who's just getting just another limb chopped off every day of the week.
Right. Well, and at Claremont, we had to do that to a degree. And I wasn't the person who was making those decisions, but Ryan Williams, our president, had to think about that in the context of John. And that was, of course, very much the strategy of the people who were going after John.
Right.
And this is why I talk about that we need to crush some of these guys. Yeah. We need to do to them what they were trying to do to John, not because I'm, vindictive and awful, but because we have to establish a credible deterrent for this type of behavior. I'm not saying that I want to go pick innocent attorneys on their side and try to ruin their lives in the same way that somebody's like John was ruined. But I'm saying if you engaged in that type of behavior, that it should be outside of all bounds of professionalism, maybe it's your career that gets ruined. And then at that point, they realize that, maybe this is actually, let's go back to having rules, because when we have rules, that things work better for everybody on both sides of the aisle.
And, looking at someone like Rudy, maybe that's a more complicated case. Might be above my pay grade as a mere talk show host. But specific to Eastman, do you think that the right at large, the established right, is ready to spend that capital that it's going to take to get him back in society's good graces?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think nothing changes people's minds like victory, right? And I think the type of victory also mattered a lot. Again, that it was so broad-based that we're going to have a majority, not just of the Electoral College, so that it was some sort of thing that the left can complain about, but even the popular vote. I think President Trump appreciates the work that John did on his behalf and that he paid for that. And I think that there's probably enough political capital to move him back in, at least to a degree. And I certainly obviously will advocate for that very strongly in whatever small capacity I can. And, we can hope that the same thing happens to other, similarly kind of put upon folks on our side.
We got about 10 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about the geopolitics of all this.
Yeah.
Because, it is, I went to a, let's say, left-leaning law school once upon a time, and it was a big deal for my con law prof that civil rights happened because of the Cold War, basically. Like, we need to be able to demonstrate to Americans, but also to the post-colonial world, that we have something to offer besides communism.
Right.
Something even better than communism, right? I think it was Steve Saylor who called the Civil War a sort of global war, war for control of the global left.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. And I think, although I was getting this from a lefty prof, I think, basically the theory of the case is true.
That's right. You'll see people on the fairly radical right make the same point. It's a little one of these woke, more correct type things.
And so, right through to the present day, yes, America has adversaries. And it is in the interest of those adversaries to keep us at each other's throats and to exacerbate those racial and ethnic divides.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting question. I don't get into it in my book because it's the sort of thing that you shouldn't just sort of speculate too much about without evidence.
Right.
But we could simply look at the history, including the history of the communist involvement in the far left of the civil rights movement, which is documented and unquestioned, to say that in the past, the left, the global left, has not hesitated to spark racial animosity in the U.S. to further its own interests. And we should certainly expect that our adversaries are probably trying to do the same, and that some of, again, I'm certainly not going to speculate about any individuals or institutions, but that it would not surprise me at all to find that some of the funding for some of the craziest stuff that's been going on, has been trafficked through people or through countries that are adversarial to us in some ways. Mm-hmm. Because certainly if I were the Chinese, I would be doing that. If I were the Chinese, I'd also be pushing for unrestricted open borders in the United States, and I would be figuring out ways to make those sorts of things happen. It would just be foolish for me as a strategist not to attempt to cripple my adversary in that way. And so while I don't have smoking guns, it just stands to reason that I think if we look a little bit, we'll certainly find those. And we have. I mean, to be fair, there are some isolated instances, which I'm aware of, where we've really been able to trace this to American adversaries, but I would not be surprised if it's a much bigger problem than we realize right now.
Yeah, I don't have smoking guns either. I did hear recently, though, from someone who would know that the Israelis became alarmed when they saw some poll out of America where it was like 60% of college students support Hamas. And
Right.
Wow, that seems like a really big number. And so you start digging into the data, and what's going on is like, well, it's basically kind of this like peer pressure preference cascade caused by the TikTok algorithm just being boosted. Basically, the Chinese just turning up all the volumes on all the Hamas stuff so that all of these young people start thinking like, well, gosh, it seems like a lot of people like me support this cause or support these people or whatever. So I guess probably I do too. And at least I should say that I do.
Right.
So that kind of stuff seems to definitely be going on.
Yeah.
It's tricky because, some amount of paranoia is probably good, and then you reach
diminishing returns.
The top of the curve, and then there's probably like a big cliff.
Right. It's probably one of the weird things. It's like the midwit meme, except the midwit is actually right in this case.
Yes.
It's the right way to think about it. But yeah, I think this is probably going on, and maybe we need like Trump talk or something. I don't know. That's gonna like battle against it. But yeah, I think certainly it's not crazy. It's been noted by many mainstream people that TikTok is controlled by a adversary of the United States, and that it is being used in that way to promote certain things, and we need to handle it with all due care for that reason.
Looking forward to the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, are you? I mean, you're a quant guy. You know how to sort of place bets on things that other people might not see. Are you expecting? Do you have any kind of like dark horse candidates for major political changes in ethnic groups? I mean, what's going to happen with sort of Jewish Americans seems to be up for grabs. There's division there. The division that's emerging between, black men and black women just on this election. This is a fluid situation, and I wonder if you're sort of tracking anything and expecting any kind of major shakeups there.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's so exciting, and I'm literally, like, right before I came over here to tape, I'm like going through all the exit polls right now, which you always have to be a little bit careful because the early exit polls are kind of wrong and they adjust, but they're not. If the group is big enough, they're not hugely wrong, and you're beginning to certainly see certain things. I talked about the Hispanic and Asian American votes in red states. I do think the fact that the left is going to realize that they no longer have a unique hold on all minority voters and can claim to speak for them is going to have some interesting possibilities for it. And it actually can kind of help move us out of some of the most poisonous elements of the racial animosity that I talk about in the unprotected class, because so much of the worst things are being done, in my view, by the left because they perceive it to be in their partisan political advantage to do so. Now that that's maybe up for grabs, now that Trump, in a pretty way that has, he's not exactly apologized for being a white guy. Okay, this is no Tim Waltz, has been able to go and win all these voters over, I think offers an opportunity for maybe some sort of a truce on these issues to be navigated through, or maybe the left, once they realize that not every single one of these immigrants is going to vote for them, becomes a little bit less passionate about pushing unlimited illegal immigration. Oh, by the way, and part of the reason they're not voting for you is because you are importing massive numbers of their people, often co-ethnics, to like take their jobs, right? Like that they have as legal Americans and American citizens. So I think that there could be some really exciting things happening there if we play our cards right. And certainly if I were to write the last chapter of my book right now, I would be I would offer some sort of more optimistic pathways. I think not that the book actually ends on an optimistic note, but I think as opposed to kind of just sort of very fairy optimism, I think we actually have some very concrete paths that we could pursue right now to kind of unify around a new American identity. And by the way, realize that in fact, having that majority American identity that is rooted in some way in our, historical European origin culture is actually a good thing, rather than having a bunch of different groups at each other's throats. And if that means that there are Asian and Black and Hispanic white supremacists, and I'm using white supremacist in air quotes right there, just to say that those are people who want to join in an American majority culture and be proud of it, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the promise of the internet, right? Is an infinite number of identities, including ones that you could never imagine. You will find people in that subcategory. To me, at least for now, until further notice, I think my big sort of strategic takeaway from this election is the prevailing wisdom that in order to get to a purple America, you had to start with a blue America, and red people had to meet them over there.
Yeah.
That's wrong. It turns out that in order to get back to a purple America, we need a red America first.
Absolutely.
Jeremy Carl, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on, James.
And that's about all the time we got over here. I am James Poulos. This is Zero Hour, and may God have mercy on us all.